August 27th, 1965. The most anticipated meeting in rock and roll history was about to happen, and nobody knew it would end, with John Lennon on the floor and Elvis Presley laughing like he'd just won the greatest battle of his life. This is the story of the night the Beatles met the King, and what happened was pure genius. Graceland, Memphis, Tennessee. The Beatles had been begging to meet Elvis for years. They'd conquered America, broken every record imaginable, and were arguably the biggest band on the planet. But there was one thing they hadn't done yet: meet the man who started it all. Elvis Presley had been watching the Beatles rise with mixed feelings. On one hand, he respected their talent. On the other hand, he'd been reading headlines like "Beatles bigger than Elvis" and "The King is dead, long live the Beatles" for 2 solid years. It was starting to get under his skin. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, had been resisting the meeting for months. He knew that any photograph of Elvis with the Beatles would be used to suggest that the torch had been passed, that Elvis was yesterday's news. But the Beatles were persistent, and eventually Brian Epstein, their manager, made an offer that was hard to refuse. The meeting would be completely private. No press, no photographers, no recordings, just musicians hanging out with musicians. Elvis finally agreed, but on one condition: it had to be at his house, his territory, his rules. When the Beatles arrived at Graceland that warm August evening, they were nervous in a way they'd never been before. John Lennon, usually the most confident and cocky of the group, was actually fidgeting with his hands. Paul McCartney kept adjusting his hair. George Harrison was unusually quiet. And Ringo Starr looked like he was about to meet God himself. Elvis greeted them in his living room, which had been set up like a private concert venue. He was wearing black pants, a red shirt, and had a bass guitar slung casually over his shoulder. The first hour was awkward. The Beatles sat on one side of the room like nervous schoolboys, and Elvis sat on the other, strumming his bass guitar and watching them with an amused expression. Finally, Elvis broke the ice with his trademark humor. "Well, if you boys are just gonna sit there and stare at me all night, I might as well go to bed," he said with that famous smirk. Everyone laughed, and the tension broke. They started jamming together. Elvis on bass, Paul on piano, John and George on guitars, and Ringo on a makeshift drum setup. They played Chuck Berry songs, Little Richard songs, and some of their own hits. For a few hours they were just musicians having fun. But John Lennon, being John Lennon, couldn't let the evening pass without stirring things up. Around midnight, with everyone relaxed and joking around, John made the challenge that changed everything. "Elvis," John said, his Liverpool accent thick with confidence fueled by a few drinks. "I've got a proposition for you." Elvis raised an eyebrow. "What kind of proposition?" John grinned. "A little friendly competition. You and me. Guitar battle. Right here. Right now. Let's see if the King can still keep up with the new generation." The room went silent. Paul's eyes went wide. George looked terrified. Ringo whispered, "Oh no, he didn't." Elvis's expression didn't change, but everyone in the room could feel the temperature drop about 10 degrees. Colonel Parker, who'd been sitting in the corner, started to stand up ready to shut this down before it became a disaster. But Elvis held up his hand, stopping the colonel without even looking at him. Elvis stood up slowly, set down his bass guitar, and walked over to where several guitars were leaning against the wall. He picked up a black Gibson and plugged it into a nearby amp. "John," Elvis said, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made everyone nervous. "You sure you want to do this?" John, too committed to back down now, stood up and grabbed his guitar. "Absolutely. Let's show these boys how it's done." What happened next was one of the most incredible guitar duels that nobody outside that room would ever witness. They started with simple rock and roll riffs, trading licks back and forth. John was good, really good. His rhythm playing was tight, his solos were creative, and he had that raw energy that defined the Beatles' sound. But Elvis was playing on a completely different level. He wasn't just playing guitar. He was telling a story with every note. His fingers danced across the fretboard with a speed and precision that shocked everyone in the room, including the Beatles, who had no idea Elvis could play like this. The public Elvis, the movie star Elvis, didn't showcase his guitar skills much anymore. But the real Elvis, the musician Elvis, the kid who'd learned guitar in the housing projects of Memphis, could absolutely shred. John started to realize he might have made a serious mistake. After about 10 minutes of trading solos, Elvis decided to end this competition in the most spectacular way possible. He launched into a version of That's All Right that was so fast, so intricate, and so perfectly executed that John Lennon literally stopped playing and just watched in awe. Elvis's fingers were moving so fast they were almost a blur. He was doing things with that guitar that shouldn't have been possible, bending strings, hitting harmonics, incorporating blues licks that he'd learned from the masters on Beale Street when he was just a kid. When Elvis hit the final note and let it ring out through the room, there was complete silence. Then Elvis did something that nobody expected. He handed the guitar to John and said, "Your turn." John looked at the guitar, looked at Elvis, looked at his bandmates, and then did something John Lennon almost never did. He laughed and admitted defeat. "I can't follow that," John said, shaking his head. "That was absolutely brilliant. I had no idea you could play like that." Elvis smiled, but it wasn't a mean smile or a gloating smile. It was almost gentle. "John," Elvis said, putting his hand on Lennon's shoulder, "you boys are incredible musicians. You've done things with music that nobody's ever done before. You've changed the whole game. But here's the thing you need to understand." Elvis paused, making sure everyone in the room was listening. "I've been doing this since before you boys hit puberty. I learned guitar from blues masters who learned from their blues masters. I've played every dive bar in the South, every county fair, every venue you can imagine. I've earned every single note I just played." Then Elvis said something that John Lennon would quote for the rest of his life. "The difference between you and me isn't talent, John. You've got plenty of that. The difference is that I know my roots. I know where this music comes from. And until you understand that, you're just playing with the surface." Elvis then sat down at the piano and started teaching the Beatles about the blues, about gospel, about the music that came up from the Mississippi Delta and changed the world. He played them songs by Arthur Crudup, by Big Boy Crudup, by Sister Rosetta Tharpe, artists who'd influenced everything he'd ever done. For the next 2 hours, Elvis gave the Beatles a masterclass in American roots music. He explained the history, the feeling, the soul behind every chord change and every vocal inflection. He told them about the black musicians who'd created this music and never got the credit they deserved. He talked about the responsibility that came with being successful in a genre you didn't invent. John Lennon, the man who was rarely humble about anything, sat at Elvis's feet like a student and absorbed every word. When the evening finally ended around 4 a.m., the Beatles left Graceland forever changed. John, especially, was different. In the car ride back to their hotel, John was quiet. For a long time. Finally, he said to Paul, "We just got schooled by the master. Everything we've been doing, everything we think we've invented, he's been doing it longer and better." But here's where Elvis's genius really showed. About a week after that meeting, each member of the Beatles received a package at their hotel. Inside were rare blues and gospel records from Elvis's personal collection, albums that were almost impossible to find. Each package included a handwritten note from Elvis. John Lennon's note read, "John, you've got the fire and the talent. Now go learn where the fire comes from. Respect the roots, and you'll grow taller than any of us. Your friend, Elvis." That meeting, that challenge, and that response from Elvis influenced the Beatles' music for the rest of their career. The complexity and depth that showed up in albums like Rubber Soul, Revolver, and especially the White Album were directly influenced by Elvis's lesson about musical roots. John Lennon talked about that night for years afterward. In a 1970 interview, John said, "Elvis taught me more in one night than I'd learned in years of playing." He didn't just beat me in a guitar duel. He showed me that being the best isn't about flash or speed. It's about understanding the soul of the music. But the story doesn't end there. In 1969, when Elvis was planning his comeback special, he reached out to John Lennon and asked for advice on how to connect with the younger generation. John's response was perfect. He wrote back, "Elvis, you don't need my advice. You taught me that being true to your roots is more important than chasing trends. Just be yourself. That's all you've ever needed to be." Their mutual respect grew deeper over the years. When Elvis performed his '68 comeback special, he wore all black leather, stripped everything back to basics, and delivered one of the greatest performances of his career. Many people don't know that John Lennon was one of the first people Elvis called after that show aired. "Did I do it right?" Elvis asked. "You did it perfectly," John replied. "You reminded everyone why you're the king." The challenge at Graceland became legendary among musicians, even though very few details were ever made public. The Beatles honored their promise not to talk about it in detail during Elvis's lifetime, but after Elvis passed away in 1977, John Lennon finally told the full story in an interview. "Elvis could have embarrassed me that night," John said. "He could have made me look like a fool. Instead, he taught me about respect, about history, about the responsibility we have as musicians. That's pure genius." The lesson Elvis taught that night went beyond guitar playing. He taught the Beatles, and through them an entire generation of musicians, that you can't just take from a musical tradition. You have to honor it, understand it, and give back to it. George Harrison later said that meeting Elvis changed how he approached the guitar. Paul McCartney credited Elvis with teaching him about the connection between different American musical styles, and Ringo said that watching Elvis that night showed him what it meant to be a true professional. Elvis's response to John's challenge wasn't about ego. It wasn't about putting the Beatles in their place. It was about teaching, about passing on knowledge, about making sure that the next generation understood what they were building on. That's what made it genius. If you're inspired by this incredible story of mentorship, respect, and musical mastery, hit that subscribe button and give us a thumbs up. This is the kind of story that reminds us what true greatness looks like. Drop a comment telling us about a time when someone turned a challenge into a teaching moment. And don't forget to click that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into music history's most incredible untold stories. The impact of that night rippled through music history in ways that most people never realized. The Beatles' music became more sophisticated, more rooted in tradition, more respectful of the pioneers who came before them. And all because Elvis chose to teach instead of just compete. In 1975, when John Lennon was going through his lost weekend period and struggling with his identity as a musician, he reportedly listened to Elvis records constantly. According to those close to him, John would say, "Elvis knew who he was. I need to remember who I am." After Elvis died, in 1977, John Lennon was devastated. He cancelled recording sessions and spent days listening to Elvis's music. When asked to comment for a news program, John said something beautiful. "Elvis didn't just change music, he changed musicians. He taught us that being great means lifting others up, not putting them down. The world doesn't just need more talented people, it needs more people like Elvis, who use their talent to teach." The guitars that Elvis and John played that night at Graceland became legendary. Elvis's black Gibson was later displayed at Graceland with a small placard that reads, "Played during the Beatles' visit, 1965. John's guitar from that night was sold at auction years later, and the buyer reported that John had carved tiny words into the back of it. "Thank you, Elvis." The meeting between John Lennon and Elvis Presley at Graceland wasn't just a meeting between two musical giants. It was a passing of wisdom from one generation to the next. It was a reminder that true greatness isn't about defending your title. It's about making sure the next generation is even better than you are. Elvis's genius that night wasn't in how fast he could play guitar or how many notes he could hit. His genius was in recognizing that John Lennon's challenge was really a young artist's way of asking to be taught. And instead of seeing a rival, Elvis saw a student. Instead of seeing competition, he saw opportunity. That's what separated Elvis from everyone else. He understood that his legacy wouldn't be measured by how many people he could beat in a guitar duel, but by how many musicians he could inspire to be better. John Lennon walked into Graceland that night, thinking he was going to challenge the king. He walked out knowing he'd met his teacher. And Elvis walked away, knowing that rock and roll would be in good hands with musicians like the Beatles carrying it forward. That night, John Lennon challenged Elvis Presley. But Elvis's response, teaching instead of just competing, turning a challenge into a lesson, showing respect for the tradition while encouraging innovation, that was pure genius. And it's a lesson that every generation of musicians since has tried to learn. The king didn't need to defend his throne that night. He just needed to show John Lennon and the Beatles how to be worthy of sitting on their own. If this story of wisdom, respect, and musical mastery touched your heart, make sure you're subscribed to The Hidden Legacy so you never miss these incredible untold stories from music history. Hit that like button, share this with someone who loves the Beatles or Elvis, and let us know in the comments what other legendary musical meetings you'd like us to explore. And be sure to click that bell icon and check out the videos appearing on your screen right now for more amazing stories about the moments that shape music history forever.